Welcome to the video today on Dynamic SQL. I'm really excited about this video because Dynamic SQL can be very powerful, but it's a two-edged sword because it can also cause some huge problems. So to compare Dynamic SQL to the standard, it would be Static SQL. And Static SQL refers to SQL statements that do not change at runtime. That's the normal SQL that we see the select, from, and the where. Comparing that then to Dynamic SQL, it refers to statements that are generated at runtime and that they can have some variability. Dynamic SQL facilitates creativity with more general purpose, flexible applications because the full text may not be known at runtime. The downsides of Dynamic SQL include the notion that Dynamic SQL is complex to write compared to Static SQL. It's often difficult to understand how the query is going to form because there's so much variability in the code, meaning you might look at data and proceed down one part of the code, or you might proceed down another part of the code. The query execution plan is built on the fly, and it's not saved unless you use the stored procedure SPexecute SQL for calling the procedure. And we're going to use that stored procedure as one of our methods here in a bit. If the execution plan is not reused, that's always a performance hit. Also, Dynamic SQL is vulnerable to SQL injection attacks. So let's look at the well-used comic strip on that. On SQL injection attacks. The mom says, "Hi, this is your son's school. We're having some computer trouble." The receptionist says, "Oh dear, did he break something?" Mom says, "Oh, in a way." The receptionist says, "Did you really name your son Robert? Quote, right paren, semicolon, drop table student, semicolon, dash dash question mark." "Oh yes, little Bobby Tables we call him," says the mother. And the receptionist says, "Well, we've lost this year's students' records. I hope you're happy." The mom says, "And I hope you've learned to sanitize your database inputs." It's an old and a very funny cartoon. Here's an example of basic normal static SQL. We look to select the company name and the city from the company information table where ticker symbol equals Apple. Here we're creating a stored procedure that is going to take one parameter, and that's the ticker symbol. So we create procedure stock name. Here it is. And we have one variable at ticker symbol. After we run the stored procedure, we can execute this portion, which is the stock name, and that's AAPL for Apple. So let's execute those two queries. And here again is the static SQL for Apple. We execute it. Notice that we have the company name and Apple Incorporated in Cupertino, California. Next, let's go to the stored procedure where we're going to pass a parameter. So we highlight create procedure stock name all the way to select. That's one thing I've seen new people do. They want to include everything, including this last line, number 8, EXEC stock name. And you don't want to include that in your stored procedure because then it keeps calling itself and it generates an error. So we execute that portion, then we run the stored procedure, passing the parameter for Apple, and that comes right in. And this is more flexible because I might choose Ford here, and I can use the same query to be far more flexible. So what happens if we try to follow the same line of reasoning and create a stored procedure? We're calling it AnyTableSelect. It's going to have a table name that's going to be passed to it. Data type is varchar 100. And we would just want to say select star from a variable. That doesn't work because as it sits right here, SQL Server will not let us pass object names as parameters. So the answer is Dynamic SQL. And here's a stored procedure that does work because we're actually putting the SQL into a string variable and then we execute the string variable. So it's the same logic as before. We're creating a procedure and we're going to pass it a table name. Then we're going to declare @SQL as a varchar 1000, and so we're stuffing this whole SQL statement into a variable. So it's @select is equal to select star from, so that's the first part of the query. @select is equal to what we had it before plus the table name. Then we execute the string. We run this stored procedure here, run it so that we have stored procedure, and then we execute the any table select, and we're passing it the stock data table. So we've seen that we can have a variable in the where clause as we do right here. But this query is going to give us an error when we run it because we have a variable in the from clause. And SQL Server does not let you pass object names as parameters from a stored procedure. So objects are including tables and columns and several other things, but you can't pass those directly or it generates an error. Here is the solution, and that's Dynamic SQL. And it works because we put SQL into a string variable and then we execute the string variable. So we create procedure, here's the name, any table select. We declare a variable @table name and it's going to be of type varchar. So we're going to have somebody pass us the table name at runtime. Then we declare @SQL to be varchar 1000. That's going to hold our entire SQL statement as a string. So we select and we set @SQL equal to select star and from. Then we add to it what we did previously plus the table name that we're going to pass. Then inside the string we do execute @SQL and go. Here then is the stored procedure. At runtime, we execute any table select, which is the name of the stored procedure, and the table name is stock data. So this approach allows us to bypass the notion that you can't have variables for object names. Another way to start Dynamic SQL is using the stored procedure execute SQL. Now initially it looks a little more complicated, but it has some advantages. It allows for statements to pass parameters, and it only allows parameters where SQL Server would normally use parameters, and it can still be built using dynamic constructs. It has strongly typed variables and parameters which reduce SQL injection attacks that we'll show here in a moment. And maybe most important, it reuses execution plans. Here's an example of the same exact code being executed with the stored procedure execute SQL. Notice the big difference is this piece of code. It starts the stored procedure execute SQL, passes the table name. This is the encoding scheme. You have to use an n varchar, and it's kind of weird, but you say @table name equal @table name, so it fills out this part of the SQL statement. Then you run this so the stored procedure is created, and then you execute the any table select stored procedure. So here is the example of invoking the SPexecute SQL stored procedure. So we start it as we do most of those now, and we do the drop procedure if it exists so that we can keep testing it until we get the version that we'd like. We create the same procedure name, any table select. and we select or declare add SQL nvarchar 1000. Again, this has to be an nvarchar to use SPexecute SQL. So I again put select star from at add SQL, and then I add that to the table name that's going to be passed. Let's execute this portion, and it's successful. And then let's do the execute and invoke again this execute SQL, and we're passing in that string, and we're going to pass a table name here. So let's include that in the whole procedure. And now we'll use the execute that entire stored procedure. And perhaps we can see that it's giving us a select star from stock data, so it'll give us all 420,000 rows as it rolls through. So that's going to be using the stored procedure SPexecute SQL. We'll see that it indeed gave us all the rows from the stock data table. So here's the first stored procedure that's going to generate an error, and we go to execute it, and we get an error. So let's go down to the other version of the stored procedure. We go from here, we execute, and then we're going to EXEC this stored procedure, any table select, and we're passing it stock data as the table. And you can see that it's doing that query, and it's running through trying to bring up all the answers here. So it's a select star from stock data. So it gives us all 429 or 420,000 rows. So that's the first example of dynamic SQL. We've talked about an SQL injection attack, and they can be very dangerous, and they can be a big problem for security. They can happen anytime that there's user input, but it seems to be an even bigger problem when using dynamic SQL. So an SQL injection attack consists of inserting an SQL query in the input data. It usually happens from the client side to the application, and the attack itself can read data, it can modify data, it can execute administrative functions, such as a shutdown on the DBMS, and it can recover the content of a given file that's present on the DBMS file system. So it can do a lot of damage. So here's an example of an SQL injection attack. We create a procedure called SQL injection here so we can remember what it is. And we always put a drop at the beginning so that we can keep working on this stored procedure until we know we've got it right. So we create it, we're taking input at VH, it's going to be 60 varchar, so it's going to hold 60 characters, so somebody can put whatever table that they'd like in here. Then we declare add SQL as a variable, it'll hold the string. Then we add to add SQL whatever is the user input. I'm going to print it so that we can show people what the statement said, and execute. So we'll run the stored procedure, we'll pass stock data, and we'll see that we've got a lot of rows that are coming. So we were able to pass it stock data as the table. I did the print so we could see the SQL statement, and it was simply a select star from stock data. Well, what if we didn't pass it stock data? What if we were malicious and we passed it sysobjects go drop database, oh crap. Let's run that. It allowed me to see all the objects in sysdata, and it dropped my database. Fortunately, it was a test one here that I didn't want to actually delete, but if somebody typed in drop database along with the table name, they could get a valid SQL statement and be malicious. So SQL injection attacks are dangerous and we need to prevent those. In summary, Dynamic SQL can be very powerful. It allows us to bypass some restrictions as we pass objects as variables. We can use the execute or EXEC, or we can use the stored procedure SPexecute SQL. We can then have a lot of power and flexibility, but we have to prevent problems such as SQL injection attacks. I, for one, really like Dynamic SQL and promote its usage, but only among seasoned SQL developers.